Would you like a thingy?
Yeah, that'd be great, thanks. So tēnā tātou katoa, greetings to you all. Ko Mount Richmond tōku moanga. Mount Richmond is my mountain. Ko Maitai tōku awa. The Maitai River in Nelson is my river. Ko Phoebe tōku waka. The Phoebe is the ship that brought my ancestors to New Zealand. No Nelson ahau. Nelson is my ancestral home, here in New Zealand anyway. Ko Britain tōku whānau. Probably all know Britain is my family name. Ko Kerry tōku inawa. My name is Kerry. I am the son of Ivan Burton, who is the son of Robert Burton, who was the son of Hugh Burton, who was the son of Samuel Burton, who was the son of John Burton, who with his wife Sarah landed in Nelson in April 1843. So Sarah, according to the marriage records, was actually his cousin, but we don't talk about that in our family. Although my older two sons reckon that explains a lot about our family. So John Burton was from Sussex. He was a shoemaker who was short-sighted, which makes you wonder about the quality of his shoes. He answered an advertisement, which I think was up on the screen behind me there, it was a second ago, where the New Zealand company advertised in England and said, come out to New Zealand as settlers and we will provide you with work. You can be a roading contractor or something else. We'll sell you some farmland. And the New Zealand company was owned by the Wakefield brothers. Edward Wakefield was the prime mover with his two younger brothers. And they really were in the business of selling land that they didn't yet own so that they could make money out of this new settlement of New Zealand. So he answered the advertisement, sailed out to New Zealand, arrived here in 1843, as I said, in April 1843. When he arrived in April 1843, there was an argument actually going on right at that time in Nelson when he landed. So Te Rauparaha was actually in, the Māori Ngātawa chief was actually in Nelson at the time, and he was having a big argument with Arthur Wakefield, the youngest of the Wakefield brothers, who was actually he was in charge of the small town at that point of Nelson, population of about 3,000. And Te Rauparaha was actually saying, you think you own land in the Wairau Plains just south of Nelson, but you don't. We never sold it to you. And Wakefield said, so I bought some. And he goes, no, you didn't. I never sold any land. And so they're having this big argument. Wakefield said to him, well, okay, let me buy the land from you. And Te Rauparaha said, no, it's never going to happen. We're not going to sell our land, not now, not ever. Wakefield said, if you don't, our surveyors are going to come in and start surveying the land. If you cause any problems, I will come in with 300 armed constables and we will take the land regardless. And Te Rauparaha said, let's talk to the governor about that and see what the governor says, because this is terribly wrong. Let's get him to arbitrate that. So Wakefield didn't wait for that. The next month he sent in some surveyors to survey the land, and they were met by Te Rauparaha with some warriors who marched them back off the land, marched them back to Nelson, and burnt down the huts that they had built. So then in June, 17th of June, what happened was that Arthur Wakefield rounded up the local magistrate, and he armed 60 of the settlers, swore them in as constables, and then they marched into the Wairau Plains to claim the land that they didn't own. They bumped into Te Rauparaha, who was there with 90 of his men and some women. There was a standoff at the stream. There was a stream where they met there in the Wairau Plains. As you actually drive from Blenheim to Picton, you actually drive past a sign, if you've ever seen it, that says the Wairau Affray, and it's right there which the battle happened. What happened was that there was this big standoff, and then Arthur Wakefield told his men to advance. They fired some shots, and one of the Māori was killed, who unfortunately was the wife of the chief, and also Te Rauparaha's daughter. So then Te Rauparaha told his men to go forward. They chased the men off the land. The settlers all took fright and ran back to Nelson, but 22 of them died. So one of them was Arthur Wakefield, who died there at that place. So the people from Nelson rushed back to Nelson, and they wrote to the governor and said, you need to come and sort out these Māori who have attacked us. They referred to it as the Wairau massacre. But the people of Nelson were terrified that the Māori were going to come and bring retribution. And so about 1,000 of the people in Nelson at the time left Nelson, fled. Some of them fled all the way back to England. Some of them fled to the North Island to the other settlement that the Wakefield brothers were starting in Wellington. And they waited for the governor to come. But every night for the next 6 months, the women and children would go into the fort at Nelson because they were so sure and the men would stand guard. And this was the situation that my great-great-great-great-grandfather arrived into. He found that, in fact, actually, the New Zealand company didn't own any land because they hadn't actually bought any land. There were no roads to build, so he was unemployed. And he was in a terrible situation. So the governor eventually met at Waitangi in the North Island, and the leaders from Nelson went up to make their complaint, along with 500 Māori. So Governor Fitzroy listened to all of this, and he said to the chiefs, he said, in the first place, he said, when I heard about this, I was terribly angry, and I thought I would bring my soldiers down and revenge the Pakeha who died. But he says, what I find now after listening to everyone was that the white men were in the wrong. They had no right to survey the land. They had no right to build the houses on the land. As they were then first in the wrong, I will not avenge their deaths. So Fitzroy's report was endorsed by Colonel Secretary Lord Stanley, who was in charge of the Colonial Office in London. And he said, the actions of the party led by Thompson and Wakefield had been manifestly illegal, unjust and unwise, and that their deaths had occurred as a natural and immediate sequence. And so that was actually one of the few cases actually where the government upheld the Māori in the dispute of the lands. What actually happened then was that my great-great-great-great-grandfather was in a serious situation. So they actually tented, they built a tent on the side of the Maitai River in Nelson. He was unemployed. Terrible financial situation. There's actually a letter on record in the government office where the magistrate writes to the governor of New Zealand and says, can I disperse some immediate emergency funds to the Britton family who are living in Nelson as paupers? And so this was actually the beginning of my story. It's the impact that the Treaty of Waitangi and the subsequent things that went on from there had on my family, and they go to the heart of my story. So a lot of it goes back to the Treaty of Waitangi. What was actually agreed in the Treaty of Waitangi? What actually was agreed to back in 1840? I think that to actually understand that, we need to actually firstly look at what was happening in the country at that time. In 1840, the population of New Zealand was just slightly over 80,000. They reckon that there were 80,000 Māori living at the time and less than 1,500 non-Māori. Most of these were whalers and traders who had come and lived in coastal areas. There were very few settlements in New Zealand, mostly coastal whaling stations and trading posts. Auckland did not exist. It wasn't actually settled until September 1846, 6 months after the treaty. Wellington had a population of 150. They had actually arrived just 1 month before the Treaty of Waitangi was signed. Christchurch had no life in it at all. It was an abandoned whaling station. The Otago Harbour had been settled, and it was known as an international whaling port. It was known as a lawless place. It was a riotous settlement which was well known for its liquor trade, prostitution and all-night parties. In fact, the guy who actually went and settled Otago Harbour, John Tucker, he went to Christchurch first, looked at Riccarton and said, this is way too swampy, we're not settling here, and went to Otago. Just saying. It's half of the... They reckon that nearly half of the Māori population had been converted to Christianity. So the Christian missionaries, Samuel Marsden, who arrived, I think it was 1811, 1812, had done a really good job of spreading the gospel, and they'd also trained Māoris to go and spread the gospel as well. And so somewhere between 30,000 and 40,000 of the 80,000 Māori were counted as Christians by the missionaries at that time. In 1835, New Zealand was actually recognised as an independent state by Britain. So what happened was James Busby, who was the New Zealand resident, he was the next best thing we had to an ambassador, he actually gathered a whole lot of chiefs up and he got them to sign a Declaration of Independence, which they called themselves the United Tribes of New Zealand. And they actually had a flag, which on Waitangi Day they still fly. It's called Te Kara. And so Britain, right in the early days, recognised that New Zealand was an independent state. And so that's actually why there was a treaty, because it was actually a treaty between an independent state and the Great Britain Empire. So that was the situation that was there. Just prior to this was actually a mad Frenchman called Baron Charles de Thierry, who sailed out to New Zealand, and he was actually looking to set up an independent state on the banks of the Hokianga, and he was going to declare himself king. He was generally held to be a little bit insane, but there was actually a lot of concern in New Zealand about this, that actually this was an attempt by France to actually come out and start settling New Zealand and claim it for themselves. And of course, there was also known in the early days of 1840 that there was a ship coming out from France to Akaroa, and that they were looking to set up a settlement there as well. So there was a lot of concern about, at that time, whether New Zealand was going to be British, whether it was going to be French, or whether it was going to be Māori, or whether the whole thing was just going to become an ugly, ugly situation, and the Māori would suffer through that. So we come to the two treaties, the Treaty of Waitangi, Treaty of Waitangi. And that really goes to the heart of the matter. We know, and it's indisputable, that there are two treaties. There's the English version of the treaty, and then there's the Te Reo version of the treaty, and they don't match. They don't say the same things. The English version talks about sovereignty being given to the Queen, which was at that time Queen Victoria, and that they would protect the Māori people and their rights, that they would make sure that the Māori people kept their land unless they wanted to sell it back. But the Māori version didn't mention sovereignty at all. It mentioned that the Queen was going to appoint a government and appoint governors, and that they would protect Māori land rights, customary rights, and everything that they treasured. And so there was no suggestion there of selling the land. The English version said that if the Māori sold the land, they could only sell it to the Crown. There was no mention of that in the Māori version at all. There's actually a lot of doubt as to whether the Māoris actually understood the concept of sovereignty. It was not an idea that was actually in their language and their culture. They would have had no idea what that even meant. And so history, as it's been taught in recent times, was that the basic problem is the fact that we have two treaties which are quite different and carry different concepts and would have been different ideas to the Māori at the time. The big question was whether this was actually fraudulently done on purpose or whether it was just simply a mistake. And then, of course, the question beyond that is, how do we live with this mistake? How do we live with these two treaties? Which one do we honour? Which one don't we honour? Is it possible to honour both at the same time, since both of them were signed by the Crown? To understand that, we need to understand that there were actually a whole lot of different parties who were involved in the way that the treaty was signed, the way that the treaty was the way it came together. Firstly, there was the Colonial Office. And the Colonial Office back in Britain, they actually had and that was led by the influential figure there was the guy on the left, James Stephen. He was a Christian man, a civil servant. He began working in the Colonial Office in London, advising politicians on remote places such as New Zealand. And for him, he actually got into that whole Colonial Office because he was concerned about slavery. And so under his guidance, and he had a big impact on the abolition of slavery, which the anti-slavery bill was passed in 1831. Then once that was passed, he turned his focus onto the rights of Indigenous people around the world. And he was actually really concerned about the way that British colonies were treating Indigenous people, particularly in Australia and some of those other places. And so the view of the Colonial Office at that time was that they didn't really want New Zealand as a colony. They didn't feel that they could afford that financially. They didn't want to get involved in a bun fight with France. There were also a lot of American whalers in the area, and they actually had a concern that if they declared New Zealand to be a state or a colony of Britain, then they would get into trouble with France and America, and they would actually take a very dim view of this. So James Stephen, Christian man, he was he's an evangelist himself. He was the nephew of William Wilberforce, who was a big driver behind the anti-slavery drive in the UK. And so he was really strong on the rights of Indigenous people. He wanted to make sure that they kept their land, and whatever happened, they would be protected by all that happened. Then there was Lieutenant Hobson. Lieutenant Hobson was a naval officer who'd proved himself in warfare. He'd fought pirates in the Caribbean, and he was a dashing young captain, very reliable, but didn't have much imagination, they described him as. So he was a good officer, but he was actually asked to draw up a treaty. He had no qualifications to draw up a treaty. He was actually just a naval officer. He hadn't any legal brain. And so he was tasked with that. He had instructions from the Colonial Office, but the Colonial Office hadn't actually given him a draft to work with. They just told him, these are the things we want you to go and to achieve. And then we have James Busby beside him there. James Busby was the New Zealand ambassador, the resident officer. And then we have Henry and Edward Williams, who translated it into Te Reo. So Lieutenant Hobson, as the servant of the Crown, later to be Governor Hobson, he had been instructed by the Colonial Office, but he actually had different beliefs about what should really happen. And then we have Henry and Edward Williams, who were given one evening to translate the whole thing into Te Reo. And so those were all massive tasks, and they all resulted in things going badly. And if you talk to legal people and you go, so talking to a judge one day, and he was saying to me that, when new legislation comes in, they have this brand new act, and it doesn't always make sense. That's the judges who actually have to put it into practice in courts and make it work. And so to actually understand it, what they do is they go back and they look at what was the intentions of the politicians who wrote the legislation. They go back and they read the press releases, they read the reviews from the Department of Justice, etc., and they go, what was the intention behind this, so that we can be true to the intention. If we look at the intention, we come back to Stephen's belief that Indigenous people needed to have their rights protected. Stevens told the Secretary of State, Lord John Russell, he said, "I would take care that the mere forms and phraseology of the contracts should embody and recognise the great cardinal principle that the lands are not ours but theirs, that we have no title to them except such as we derive from purchase, and that their future claims upon us in respect of such lands are the claims not of paupers for alms, but of vendors for the fulfilment of a binding contract." So James Stevens was saying that their land is their land. We need to make sure we protect that right. And if we actually end up buying the land, we need to make sure that they are actually treated as any other British citizen would be treated, that they have the full rights of the law behind them in terms of everything that happens in terms of a binding contract. The first Prime Minister, or Premier as he was called in those days, of New Zealand was a man called Henry Sewell. He was actually also Attorney General at a different time. And he identified the principal causes of all the problems as being insistence by the Crown that sovereignty, the form of sovereignty they were following, left no scope for Maori government or law. So he was saying, this whole idea that the treaty says that the British are sovereign and that everything comes under there and there's only one law and one government is totally wrong. This is not how it was intended to be. And if we had actually just followed the letter of the treaty, we wouldn't be in this situation. We wouldn't have seen the Māori Wars. We wouldn't have seen all the things that happened. He actually argued against the fact that all subjects of the Queen were subject to the same law, and he said such an idea was just superficial. He wrote in his memoirs, "Natives as well as settlers are, it is true, equally subjects of Her Majesty, but there is nothing inconsistent with Her Majesty's paramount authority in permitting natives to enjoy as law their own usages and customs, nor anything criminal in their seeking to embody this native law in some fixed form under a head and magistrates of their own choice." So what he was saying, and what it seems James Stephen intended when they originally sent those instructions to Hobson, was that they would actually they would appoint the Queen as sovereign, but in appointing the Queen as sovereign, they would actually protect the Māori rights. And so the view of the Colonial Office at that point was that New Zealand had very few non-Māori people in it. There was less than 2,000 non-Māoris in New Zealand at all. And they were around the coast, and they would stay that way. They would just stay around the coast. The Māoris would look after the interior and the other parts of New Zealand. And so the government of New Zealand would look after, the British appointed government would look after the Europeans, and the Māoris would form their own leadership to look after the Māoris. They would protect their laws and their customary rights. And so it was really, the idea was partnership. And the idea was that these two people would work together, respecting each other's laws, and it would be a covenant type of relationship. So this idea of one state, two peoples governing their own people by their own laws and customs. This was the job that Hobson was told to put together. And so Hobson arrived at the beginning of February in 1840, came off the boat, and this non-legal person, this naval captain, in 3 days, cobbled together what we now know as the English version of the Treaty of New Zealand, of Waitangi. And so James Busby, who was the New Zealand resident officer from Britain, gave him some help with that. They put it together. And then overnight, on the night of the 4th, beginning of the 5th of February, the English version was translated into Te Reo by Henry Williams and his son Edward. And so the whole thing came together very fast, put together by people who weren't experts and put together by people who were still, in effect, really learning Te Reo and trying best to actually take all these concepts from English law and translate them into a way that Māori would understand in their culture. And so instead of talking about sovereignty, in the Te Reo version, Henry Williams talked about governance. He talked about chiefly rights being maintained, because this was the best way that he could explain it. And this was what the Māori chiefs heard on the day. And so on the morning of the 5th of February, the Māori and English versions of the treaty were put before a gathering of northern chiefs. They weren't all the chiefs of New Zealand, in a large marquee on the lawn in front of Busby's house at Waitangi. Hobson read the treaty in English, and then Williams read the Māori translation and explained each section and warned the chiefs not to rush to decide whether to sign. Because he was a Christian, Henry Williams, and he was one of the missionaries, he actually explained it this way. He said, "This is Queen Victoria's act of love to you. She wants to ensure you that you keep what is yours, your property, your rights and privileges, and those things that you value. Who knows when a foreign power, perhaps the French," so he was playing on the sphere of the French, "might take this country. This treaty is really like a fortress to you." And so he was saying, what we're doing is we're coming to declare sovereignty, but it's to protect you and to look after you in a way. It's Queen Victoria's act of love to you. And so it was a beautiful day apparently, and for the next 5 hours, the Māori chiefs debated this treaty. Much of that discussion was recorded by William Colenso, who worked at the mission station. And so there was the Anglican missionaries, and there was also the Catholic missionaries who were led by Bishop Pompalia. Bishop Pompalia, a Frenchman, he said to the chiefs, "You should not sign this treaty. You should not sign this treaty at all." He was worried about two things. Firstly, he was French, and he was concerned about British sovereignty. Secondly, he was concerned that this was being driven by Anglican missionaries, and he was concerned about what this would mean for the Catholic faith in New Zealand. So he said to them, "You should not sign this. You don't need a governor. You don't need this treaty at all. It's going to be of no benefit to you. Please don't sign it." And then he left before the treaty was signed. So one of his followers, Rewa, who was a Catholic chief, he said, "The Māori people don't want a governor. We aren't European. It's true that we have sold some of our lands, but this country is still ours. We chiefs govern this land of our ancestors." Another chief argued that all land unjustly purchased by Europeans should be returned. And that was actually a big deal at the time. Hobson actually had taken time to say, if you sign this treaty, we will investigate all prior land purchases, and all future land purchases can only be sold to the Crown. So we'll protect you, because you won't be able to do purchases to individual settlers. You can only sell to the Crown. And so he had explained that as one of the benefits. And so they said, "We want our land returned that has been taken from us by dodgy purchasers. Another chief said, yesterday, as I walked through the streets here, I was cursed by a white man. Is that the way things are going to be? Is that the way that you're going to treat us? Some of the chiefs had actually travelled to Australia, and they had extremely grim stories to tell about how the Aborigines were being treated. There were some Protestant chiefs who had actually been, who'd given their lives to Christ under the ministry of the Anglican missionaries, and some of them were accepting of the governor and said, this is not a bad idea. One of them was a man called Honi Heki, and he said, Governor, you should stay with us and be like a father. If you go away, then the French or the rum sellers will take us Māori over. How can we know what the future will bring? If you stay, we can all be as one with you and the missionaries. And so there was this idea that the missionaries were there to protect them, and a lot of the discussion was actually around the fact that a governor was going to be appointed. And at the end of the day, Hobson recorded and said to somebody else at the time, and it was recorded, that the discussion seemed to be going against them. A lot of the discussion actually that went against them was the fact that the Māori were saying, why do we need a governor? Why are you being promoted over us? If we're all governors and we're all equal, well, that would be fine, but why do we need a governor? And so this idea of having a governor was a problem to them. But then what actually happened was that there was a debate that was going to go on. It was going to go on for the next day, the 6th of February. So Hobson was in his tent. In fact, actually what happened the night before, on the night of the 5th, was that the Māori were sitting around their campfires, and there were English settlers who were going around causing trouble. And they were saying to these Māori chiefs, they said, you've lost the land now, the land is now ours, and you're nothing but slaves. And they were saying those sorts of things. And the chiefs were going to Henry Williams as one of the chief missionaries and saying, what is this? Why are they saying that? And Henry Williams just held the line and said, well, this is actually for your protection. If you sign this treaty, all these things will go away. So Hobson and the English were expecting, the British were expecting that this discussion would go on right through the day of the 6th. And so he was rather stunned when the Māori chiefs came to him and said, we're ready to sign on the morning of the 6th. The belief is that, the weather was turning, and it looked as if that there was going to be some heavy rain, and the chiefs were wanting to go home. And so they were like, well, we'll sign you a bit of paper, and then we'll go home. But most importantly, and every account of the signing of the treaty will say the same story, the Māori leaders were heavily influenced by the missionaries. They trusted the missionaries like Samuel Marsden and Henry Williams, and they trusted their advice and their explanation of the treaty. The missionaries had explained the treaty as a covenant between Māori and Queen Victoria, the head of state in the Church of England. With nearly half of the population following Christianity, many looked at the treaty as a biblical covenant, a sacred bond. And so they looked at this as being like a marriage covenant, where the English and the Māori would come together in a covenant somewhat like marriage, and there'd be two people coming together to covenant, to work together, to live together, and to be one people. And so one by one they came and they signed the treaty. As each one signed, Hobson shook their hand and said to them, He iwi tahi tātou, we are now one people. The Māori chiefs were very encouraged by that. They were delighted that he said that. The Christian Māori chiefs understood him to be saying, this is a covenant, this is an agreement that we've made. You've made an agreement now with Queen Victoria, the Crown, and we are one people in a biblical sense. We are one people under Christ. You know, from the time that the treaty was signed, there were problems. There were problems straight away. I mean, they went around the rest of the country and they signed it with other tribes. Not all the tribes signed it. Some of the chiefs came to Hobson and said, we want our money, we want to give you your gifts back, we want our name taken off the treaty. He disregarded that. And he wrote back to England and said the chiefs have all signed, and New Zealand is now part of the sovereign state of the British Empire. It's now a colony, and we have sovereignty, which was actually really not the case at all. So the treaty, the fact that there were two versions of the treaty, the fact that there was differences, the fact that there was a growing population of settlers coming and there was no land for them, was starting to cause problems. The New Zealand Company was still agitating. I mean, this was 1840. And so they were pushing for the same sort of system as happened in America, where the Americans would say, hey, if we find land and there's nobody on it, then it's land that can be claimed, if it's unoccupied land. And so this principle of discovery, as it was called, was what they were pushing for. But James Stephen, back in the Colonial Office, he said, this is not right. The land is not theirs unless we have bought it. And so the New Zealand Company and the British Colonial Office were in conflict about this all the time. Lord Russell, in December 1840, he actually opposed the New Zealand Company by saying of Māori, they have been formally recognised in Great Britain as an independent state. And even in assuming the dominion of the country, this principle was acknowledged. For it is on the deliberate act and cessation of the chiefs on behalf of the people at large that our title rests. So in other words, our title rests on the treaty, and we need to honour the treaty. Lord Russell's successor as Secretary of State for Colonies was Lord Stanley. He told the House of Lords in 1845 that the extent of Māori interests in property and land was dependent on Māori law and custom, which had to be examined to find the answer. In other words, he was saying, if there's any debate about land, we need to go back to the Māoris and go, how do you understand this? And we need to actually operate based on their understanding. In 1845, Lord Stanley made the following speech, and he was a committed and devout Christian. He said, that law and that custom are well understood among the natives of the islands. By them we are agreed to be bound, and by them we must abide. These laws, these customs, and the rights arising from them on the part of the Crown, we have guaranteed when we accepted the sovereignty of the islands. And be the amount at stake smaller or larger, as far as native title is proved, be the land waste or occupied, barren or enjoyed, these rights and titles the Crown of England is bound to honour to maintain, and the interpretation of the Treaty of Waitangi with regard to these rights is that, except in the case of the intelligent consent of the natives, the Crown has no right to take possession of the land, and having no right to take possession of the land itself, it has no right, and so long as I am a minister of the Crown, I shall not advise it to exercise the power of making over to another party that which it itself does not possess. And so he's saying, we have no right to take the land unless they are intelligently advised and they make an intelligent decision to sell the land. And so we actually have no right to sell it to somebody else, in fact, if we don't own it. So stop all the land grabbing that is going on. You know, it's time is running out, but I want to touch on something else that followed. Because as time went on, the population increased dramatically. So in 1840, the population of New Zealand was just slightly over 80,000. By 1860, it had grown to 1.2 million. And there was still not a lot of land that had been sold to or taken by the settlers at that time. And so these people were building up in the towns and cities. There was a lot of unrest. As well as that, New Zealand was actually in financial difficulty. And so what was being talked about in Parliament quite openly was the fact that we need to take the land and then we need to sell the land to settlers, and that will then get us out of our financial difficulty. So in 1860, the Taranaki land wars started. What actually happened was that there was a Māori guy called Tiera, and on the property title they called him Taylor. But he owed some merchants in New Plymouth £200. And so the local representative of the Crown went to him and said, so if you sell us these 600 acres in Waitara, called the Waitara block, if you sell these to us for £200 and we'll wipe your debt off and we'll take the land and it'll all be square. So he sold this land even though he didn't even own the land. So he never actually owned that 600 acres, but they got him to sign it anyway. And then they actually moved on to it with surveyors. So the Māori took a very dim view of this, as you can imagine. They said, this is our land. They marched the surveyors back to New Plymouth. And then what happened was the militia arrived, thinking that they would gain an easy victory over the Māori. But the Māori gave them a severe thrashing and sent them back to New Plymouth. And so all hell broke loose. The soldiers arrived. In the next 12 months, there were 12 staged battles. The settlers didn't do too well. The Māoris proved to be very dangerous opponents, much more than they had thought. And so in 1861, the government said, let's have a ceasefire while we think about this. And so they had a ceasefire, and they said, let's investigate what happened with the Waitara block. So they appointed a board of inquiry. The board of inquiry came back and said, well, these are our findings. Firstly, the taking of the Waitara block was illegal. It should never have happened. The land should never have been confiscated. So that was wrong. But the Māori rebelled against the Crown, and that clearly was wrong as well. So we're going to confiscate pretty much all of Taranaki, 1 million acres, and it now belongs to the Crown. I don't know how that sounds to you, but it sounds like the ultimate rip-off to me. And so the Taranaki Māori Wars started, and many lives were lost, and all sorts of things happened. And then in 1867, two Māori chiefs who were recognised as prophets, Te Whiti and Tohu, they actually said, let's step back from this, conflict, and they actually started a peaceful village called Parihaka in the shadow of Mount Taranaki and quite close to where Opunaki is nowadays. And so Tofu and Te Whiti, they started this town, and they said, this is a place of refuge. This is a place of faith. It's a place of peace. And we are going to claim back our land, and we're going to hold our land by a policy of passive resistance. We will not hold any arms. We will not fight. We will just stay constant in the face of European aggression, and we will not ever strike back. If they strike us, we will turn the other cheek. They had three principles at Parihaka, and sometimes you see Parihaka as a symbol of three feathers. They were peace, goodwill, and glory. And those three things were taken from the story of the birth of Jesus, where the angels came and said, peace and goodwill to all men. Glory be on high. And so these were men of faith. They gathered the people. And as Māori lost their land around the country, they all quietly gathered at Parihaka and became part of this settlement. It eventually became known as the largest Māori village in all of New Zealand. And so this became a bit of a problem for the government, because the people at Parihaka were saying, we will not sell our lands. We will not give up our lands. We are here and we're occupying them. These are our lands. They have not, the ones that you have confiscated from us, they're not your lands. And so what happened was that the militia, or the surveyors would come and they would survey the land, and then the Māori would come and they would pull all the pegs out and they would plough the land and plant a crop. And so you see a picture there. I'm not quite sure whether these were the surveyor pegs that remained from that time, but they pulled out many, many of these surveyor pegs and ploughed the land. And they said this was quite remarkable. They would actually, surveyors would come and survey it during the day. That night they would come, they'd pull out the survey pegs, and then 20 to 30 people would there be ploughing the land, planting a crop. And the next day they would come back and find that there was a crop where their surveyor pegs had been. And so they started arresting the ploughmen. They were known as the ploughmen. And so they would come and they would arrest them. They never resisted. They were just taken away to jail and put into prison. But the more that they arrested, the more Māori came from all over New Zealand to be part of this ploughing. And so it got to a point where they didn't have prisons to hold them all. And so they started exporting them to the South Island. And they were being held illegally without trial. There's a story of, actually these were the last of the ploughmen that were arrested. And this was there were questions being asked in Britain about this. In the House of Lords, they were saying, what is going on over there in New Zealand, and why are they treating the Māori that way? And so it was becoming an embarrassing situation for New Zealand, even though it was not reported favourably at all in New Zealand at all. New Zealand was still just, if you look back at the papers at that time, they were just appalling cartoons about Māori. And they were just ridiculed in every way. At the very last trial, there were 59 ploughmen that had been arrested. They were in court, and so they had a hearing. They talked about what had happened. They had ploughed the land. They'd been pulled in. And then the jury were asked to go away and make a decision. The jury went away and came back and said, we can't make a decision. So the judge said to them, look, it's getting late at night. I need you to make a decision. If you don't make a decision, I'm going to lock you up for the night. He'd said that to the jurors. And he said, you don't need to be worried about me giving them a bad sentence. He says, if you find them guilty, he said, I'll just sentence them for 1 hour, and then we can let them go, and we've satisfied the law. So they went away, and they came back and they said, yeah, sure, we find them guilty. So he actually then sentenced them and said, you've been found guilty. you were being imprisoned for 2 years, hard labour in Littleton. And they were sent to Littleton, where they worked. Many of them didn't come back. They got sick and died in prison. But the Pari Haka continued on, and they continued to resist. And so what they did was they started building a road. They planned to build a road that would go right through the middle of Pari Haka. And they said, well, why wouldn't you want a road through your town? And they said, because we know what you're planning. And you see, one of the really sad things was after the whole thing with the Waitara block, when they had taken that land and they'd been told, then it was found that it was wrong and they took all that land, the 1 million acres. The Māori chiefs then said to them, we see how you Christians behave. We see what you preach, but we see how you really behave. Because during that year, when all those battles were going on, you burnt down our churches. You attacked us on Sunday. Is this the gospel of peace and love that you brought to New Zealand? Is this what you would want us to believe? Is this how you act? Is this what Christians do? And they said, there was a famous saying at the time, they said, you say ABC, and we will do ABC. By which they meant was, you actually, the things that you're saying, we're going to do the things that you do. And so that became their cry through that time. We are learning fast what you Pākehā really mean when you say peace and love and when you tell us the gospel of Jesus Christ. And about that time, many of the Māori started falling away from Christianity. Can you blame them? Not really. Because they're saying, this is how Christians behave. And that's one of the great tragedies of this time. And so Pari Haka, they formed this road, and Te Whiti and Tohu said, do not resist. Every time they would actually start building the road, they'd come and they would plough it up and plant crops. But they had armed people building this, and they just kept coming through. And then it was actually the 5th of November, 1881, Guy Fawkes Day. The militia came. They'd actually run out of time. They came to Pari Haka, 1,500 of them, armed. They planted a cannon on the hill, and then they marched their troops into Pari Haka because they said, this is actually becoming an embarrassment to us. They are questioning our sovereignty, and we can't let that stand. If we are going to have sovereignty in this country, then we need to actually destroy Pari Haka. So the native minister at the time, who should have been representing the Māori people, his name was Bryce. He came in, he was riding a white horse. He was the one who actually had instigated and inflamed all of this. And they went marching into Pari Haka. So what happened was when they marched in, and there'd been big articles in the paper saying how, the Māoris were arming and they were going to set up an army and they were going to come through and wipe everybody out. And there was a lot of stuff in the paper that was just blatantly untrue. So as the troops came in, they were actually met by children dancing and offering them food. And they couldn't believe this, and so there was this big standoff where they marched into the middle of Pari Haka. And there in this large village, they found all the people sitting on the ground just waiting to meet them. And Te Whiti and Tofu had said, whatever they do, don't respond. So they would come charging up to them with their guns, and they would just sit there quietly. John Bryce got there and he said, I command you to leave the town. They just sat there quietly. And so over the next few days, they started physically carting them off. They destroyed the town. There were many atrocities against the women particularly. Many of them were raped. And the behaviour of the soldiers was absolutely appalling. The houses were all destroyed. Many things were stolen. And the people were dispersed. Tofu and Te Whiti were arrested and taken down to the South Island, even though they were never tried. So this is our history. I don't know how you feel about it, but it grieves me deeply. Listening to that story, you may get the impression that the Māoris never did anything wrong, and there were instances where they did things which were not smart, not wise. But given the way that they were treated and the way that things were done to them, I don't know that you can blame them. Yesterday I was talking to a friend of mine who in the Hawke's Bay, and he was saying to me, because I'd rung him and said we should go fishing again. We used to go fishing up in the Uruiwas, Waikaremoana and Lake Waikiriti. And he said, oh no, we can't go fishing there anymore, Kerry, because the Uruiwas, I don't know if you know, that's actually owned by the Tūhoe. And they operate the national park there in partnership with DOC an agreement that was entered into a few years ago. And he said, you can't actually go into the Uruwas anymore. He said they've closed it off. You can't do any of the walking tracks. They're all just falling apart. You're not allowed to go fishing because it's only for the Māori people now. And so he goes, the great walk that went around Lake Wakaramawana, which was a popular tourist track, you're not allowed to walk it anymore. If you ring the dock centre, the phone just rings, and the two people who man that will not answer. And if you try to go there, they'll discourage you and walk you off. And so when I heard that, I was disappointed. I was like, wow, we had some magic times in those lakes. Great area. But when you think about what was done to the Māori people, I was thinking about it later that night, can you really blame them, given what was done to them? And so there are wrongs on both sides, but I would say, certainly in all the reading that I've done, is that the vast majority of wrong was done by us. And as Christians, particularly as a Christian, and bearing in mind the way that the Christians, missionaries particularly, had an influence in treating the Waitangi and making the Treaty of Waitangi happen, I look at that and I go, we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to the treaty. We have a responsibility to the Māori people. What does reconciliation look like? How do we try now, 162 years later, to put this right? And I don't know that there are any easy answers to that. But I believe we have an obligation to do that. What does that look like for us? I would have loved to have had a discussion about how we in Rangiora, which is predominantly a white town, can actually reach out. As I was praying about this, the verse that came to me was actually Micah 6 verse 8. He has shown you, a man, what is good. What does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. I think in regard to the Māori people, we haven't done that. And there is work to be done. One suggestion I would make, I don't know if many of you have been out to Tuahiwi. Tuahiwi is the local marae, and it's the main meeting place of the Ngāi Tahu, the main tribe here in the South Island. If you've never been to Tuahiwi, I encourage you to go. They have open days there quite regularly, and when I went, I found it incredibly helpful to understand the local people. And I think if there's going to be reconciliation, if there's going to be restoration, it probably happens one conversation at a time. And somehow we need to start that conversation. So if you haven't been to Tuahiwi, I would encourage you to go. You can make inquiries. They have some stuff on their website. They have a booklet that tells you what their customs are and how to respect those when you're there. But it's a lovely day, and it's a really good way to start that conversation. So as we go from here, because it's now about 10 past 8, and I think we probably should be concluding. I've talked far longer than I was planning to talk, but our history is a sad one in this respect. And I think, particularly as Christians, there are things that we need to do. And I would encourage you to pray about that, to think about that, and to ponder that question. How is it that we can bridge the gap? Maybe it's learning te reo. Maybe it's going to Tuahiwi. Maybe there are other things that you can do. If you have ideas, I'd love to hear from you. I would love, as a church, to actually be reaching out, but also, at the end of the day, if this is going to happen, it's going to happen person to person before it can happen in a greater way. I don't know if I've covered this very well, but this is my heart, and I hope this is your heart as well. I'm going to pray. Let's pray. Father God, you've called us to be ministers of reconciliation. You've called us to be a people who love others, even as we love ourselves. But Father, the story of New Zealand is a story of people putting themselves first and other people suffering as a result of that. So we look to the past, Father, and we seek to learn the lessons that will take us into the future, into a better tomorrow for all New Zealanders, for Pākehā, for non-Māori and for Māori. Father, even though 162 years have gone by and we can't take those years back, help us to walk into the future with the intent to walk into a better future, to build a better future, to build a future that is good for all people of New Zealand. Father, I think of those words of Governor Hobson, we are now one people. I pray and look forward to a time when truly we can be one people. Father, forgive us for the things of the past where we've done that wrong. Forgive us, Father, for the sins of our fathers. And I pray, Father, that you would plant in us a heart that says we will love God with all our heart and we will love others in the equal measure to how we love ourselves. So be with us, bless us, Father, on this journey. Help us as we seek to reach out. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks for coming.